It is 2,140 hours. December 14th, 1941. Inside a wooden building on a fully operational Axis airfield in Tamat, Libya, 30 German and Italian pilots are eating, drinking, playing cards, safe behind their own lines. Hundreds of miles from the front, nobody comes out here. The desert makes sure of that. Nobody would be that stupid. The door shatters. In the doorway stands a British officer, 6 feet 4 inches tall, covered in desert grime, who has just walked across miles of enemy territory in pitch darkness. He is one of 6 men. 6, against an entire airbase. By midnight, 24 Axis aircraft will be smoking ruins. The airbase will be unrecognizable, and these 6 men will vanish back into the desert like they were never there. Here is the part that should bother you. At this exact moment in the war, the entire Royal Air Force, with its thousands of pilots, its Spitfires, its Hurricanes, its vast infrastructure, was struggling to achieve destruction on this scale. One man with a canvas bag and a death wish had just outperformed an Air Force. 6 men, 24 aircraft, 0 RAF planes lost in the same operation. But to understand how 6 men that Cairo headquarters called scruffy vagabonds pulled off something that seemed frankly impossible, we need to go back. Back to a hospital bed. Back to a failure so complete it nearly ended everything before it started. Before we do, if you are the kind of person who finds this story interesting, there are a few thousand more where it came from. Stories about the people history almost forgot, the ideas that weren't supposed to work, and the moments that changed everything while nobody in charge was paying attention. Hit subscribe and the bell. It costs nothing, and it means the next one finds you. Now, back to the desert. His name is David Stirling, Lieutenant Scots Guards, 25 years old, son of a brigadier general, graduate barely of Cambridge. A man who, in the years before the war, was better known for gambling debts, a fondness for nightlife, and a half-formed plan to climb Everest than for any military distinction whatsoever. He is lying in the Alexandria Scottish Hospital because he made an unauthorized parachute jump using parachutes that were not his units. They had been delivered to the wrong address and quietly liberated by a fellow officer named Jock Lewes, and Stirling, never one to let logistics get in the way of an idea, tagged along. On the jump, his canopy snagged on the tail of the aircraft. He hit the ground at speed, temporary paralysis from the waist down. The generals in Cairo, when they heard about this, were not sympathetic. One described Stirling as harebrained. Another suggested the incident proved exactly why men like him should be kept far away from anything important. They were not wrong about the unauthorized parachutes. They were catastrophically wrong about everything else. Because lying in that hospital bed, unable to walk, Stirling was doing the one thing his commanders never expected. He was thinking, specifically, he was thinking about something that seemed obvious once you saw it, but that the entire British military establishment had somehow missed completely. The desert, the vast, supposedly impassable, featureless Sahara that everyone on both sides treated as dead space between the real war, was not a barrier. It was a road, an unguarded road, leading directly to the enemy's most valuable and least protected assets. His airfields, his fuel, his supply lines, his aircraft, parked in neat rows, engines cold, mechanics sleeping, nobody watching. Small teams, Stirling wrote in a memo that he composed in pencil from his hospital bed, inserted deep. Not through the front door, through the back. Through the desert that nobody used because nobody believed it could be used. Hit the targets before anyone knew you were there. Disappear before the response could arrive. He called it the element of surprise in its purest form. Getting this memo to anyone who mattered was the problem. Stirling, still on crutches, could not get an appointment. The formal channels in Cairo said no. The gatekeepers at Middle East headquarters said no. Everyone with a desk and a title said no. So he did what anyone, with his specific combination of aristocratic confidence and total disregard for protocol, would do. He walked straight through the gates of Middle East headquarters, abandoned his crutches when a guard spotted him, half ran through the corridors of the building, ducked into the wrong office, realized his mistake, reversed, ducked into the next office, and found himself face to face with Major General Neil Ritchie, Deputy Chief of Staff. He handed Ritchie the memo before anyone could throw him out. Ritchie read it. then walked it directly to Commander-in-Chief Auchinleck. Stirling was given 66 men, no equipment, no budget, and a tent in the desert. He was told to prove it worked. His unit's very first operation, before any enemy had been engaged, before a single bomb had been placed, was to steal everything they needed from a nearby New Zealand regiment's camp. Tents, tables, bedding, chairs, reportedly, a piano. They were off to a promising start, and the war they were about to fight looked nothing like the one their commanders had planned for. Rommel's Afrika Korps had been humiliating British forces for months. The key to his success was air power. Luftwaffe aircraft providing close air support, disrupting British supply lines, giving Rommel real-time intelligence about everything the British were doing. Without those aircraft, his famous armored advances stalled. The RAF knew this. They were trying to fix it the conventional way, through aerial combat, bombing missions, fighter sweeps over German airfields. It was not working. German fighters, particularly the Messerschmitt Bf 109, were outperforming the Hurricanes that made up the bulk of British desert air strength. The RAF was losing planes at a rate it could barely sustain. Shooting down Axis aircraft in the air was expensive, dangerous, slow, and increasingly ineffective. Meanwhile, those same Axis aircraft, when they landed, were sitting on airfields that were technically behind enemy lines, but hundreds of miles from any real threat. The Germans guarded the fronts with everything they had. Nobody guarded the rear, because nobody had ever needed to. Stirling's unit, officially designated L Detachment, Special Air Service Brigade, a name deliberately chosen to make German intelligence believe an entire British parachute brigade existed in North Africa, when in fact there were 66 men in a tent, was given one mission: get to those airfields and destroy what the RAF couldn't touch from the air. Their first attempt would answer, definitively, the question of whether this was genius or madness. Operation Squatter, November 16th, 1941. 5 obsolete Bristol-Bombay transport aircraft laboring through a black sky over Libya. 55 men in parachute gear, silent, faces tight. Outside, the aircraft was being thrown around by gale force winds that the weather briefing had not predicted, or had predicted, and someone had failed to mention. 55 men jumped into a desert storm. The wind scattered them across miles of featureless sand. Men were killed on landing. Equipment was destroyed. Teams that managed to find each other in the darkness had no idea where they were. The targets, 5 German airfields, were never reached, never even seen. Of the 55 men who jumped, 21 returned. 0 aircraft were destroyed. Back at headquarters in Cairo, the verdict was swift. The SAS was a failure, a waste of resources, an embarrassment. Senior officers moved immediately to have it disbanded. Stirling had approximately 1 month to prove them wrong. What happened in that month changed not just this war, but the entire future of how elite military forces are conceived, trained, and used. The first thing Stirling understood after Squatter was that parachuting was the problem, not the concept. If you could drive to the target through the desert that the enemy ignored, you removed the single catastrophic point of failure that had destroyed the first mission. No weather dependency, no navigation guesswork from the air, no equipment destroyed on landing. You simply drove through terrain the enemy had decided was impassable, and arrived at the target on your own schedule. The organization that made this possible was the Long Range Desert Group, and if the SAS is the famous name in this story, the LRDG is the unsung one. These men had been navigating the Sahara since 1940. They were not conventional soldiers. They were navigators, mechanics, and desert specialists who had spent months learning every dune field, every dried riverbed, every track through the deep interior. To understand what that actually meant in practice, consider the distances involved. A typical LRDG insertion route ran 300 miles or more through terrain with no roads, no landmarks, no water, and temperatures that swung 50 degrees between midday and midnight. A single mechanical failure 200 miles from the nearest Allied position was not an inconvenience. It was a death sentence. Navigation was done by theodolite and stars, the same instruments a Victorian explorer would have recognized. The desert was not passable because it was easy. It was passable because these particular men had spent months learning exactly how hard it was and building systems to survive it anyway. They had already proven what Stirling theorized. The desert could be crossed. The enemy wasn't watching it, and if you knew what you were doing, you could move through it at will. Stirling's insight was to combine the LRDG's navigation with his own unit's capacity for violence. The LRDG would drive them to the target. The SAS would handle what happened when they got there. The partnership that resulted would, in 15 months, destroy more than 250 aircraft on the ground, dozens of supply dumps, and hundreds of enemy vehicles, at a cost in manpower that a single conventional infantry battalion would consider a quiet Tuesday. But getting to the airfield was only half the problem. What happened when you arrived was the other half. And this is where a man named Jock Lewes changed everything. Lieutenant Jock Lewes was an Oxford rowing blue, a scholar, and by all accounts the most disciplined and technically precise man in the unit. Where Stirling was the strategist and Mayne was the weapon, Lewes was the engineer. He had personally designed the SAS training program from scratch, building the standards of physical endurance, navigation, and demolition that turned Stirling's 66 volunteers into something that actually worked. He understood, immediately, that standard British demolition charges were wrong for what the SAS needed to do. Too heavy, too bulky. A man carrying standard explosives could destroy 1 or 2 aircraft before he ran out of material or time. The mathematics of small team raiding required something different. Lewes spent weeks in the desert experimenting with thermite compounds, plastic explosive, and an oil binder, working through combinations until he had something that worked. What he produced, which became known as the Lewes bomb, weighed approximately 1 pound. It could be pressed directly onto an aircraft's fuel tank or engine cowling using its own adhesive compound. When it detonated, the thermite ignited the fuel. The aircraft didn't just get damaged, it burned completely. One man, carrying a dozen Lewes bombs in a canvas bag, could walk down a line of aircraft in the dark and destroy 12 planes in under 30 minutes. The time pencil fuses were set for roughly 30 minutes, giving the team time to clear the area before the first explosion. By the time the base woke up, the team was already gone, and there was nothing to shoot at. The conventional approach to destroying parked aircraft required air missions, anti-aircraft suppression, navigation, coordination, fuel, crews, and still regularly failed. The Lewes bomb approach required 1 man, a canvas bag, and 30 minutes of silence. The generals in Cairo described this methodology as ungentlemanly. They meant it as a criticism. Stirling's men filed it as a compliment and moved on. Jock Lewes did not live to see what his bomb made possible. On December 30th, 1941, 16 days after Tamet, he was being driven back through the desert by an LRDG patrol when a German aircraft spotted the convoy and attacked. Lewes was killed in the strafing run. He was 30 years old. Stirling later said that losing Lewes was the single hardest blow the unit ever absorbed, harder than any raid that went wrong, because Lewes was the one man whose judgment and discipline nobody else could fully replace. The bomb he built kept destroying aircraft for the rest of the war. He never saw it. But the bomb was only part of it. Getting close enough to place it was a problem the Lewes bomb couldn't solve on its own, and the solution the SAS found for that problem was one that the polished officers back in Cairo found almost as offensive as the bombs themselves. The unit stopped looking like the British Army. They wore Arab headscarves, keffiyehs, because the LRDG had discovered they were more practical in desert heat than anything the British quartermaster supplied. They grew beards because shaving in the deep desert was a luxury nobody had time for. They stripped their vehicles of everything unnecessary and covered them in sand-colored camouflage. No insignia, no regimental markings, nothing that identified them at a distance. The result was that from any range beyond 100 meters, an SAS patrol looked nothing like a British unit. In the confusion of desert warfare, where Axis forces operated vehicles and uniforms from a dozen different nationalities, this ambiguity was a tactical weapon. Several raids in 1942 succeeded, partly because perimeter guards who spotted the approaching vehicles initially assumed they were friendly forces before it was too late to matter. A bomb that burned everything it touched. A unit invisible until it chose not to be. 2 problems. Solved. Which left one more. Someone still had to walk through the door. Robert Blair Mayne joined the SAS because David Stirling went looking for him specifically. Mayne was, depending on which historical account you read, either under close arrest or recently released from it for assaulting his commanding officer when Stirling found him. The exact circumstances are disputed. What is not disputed is what Mayne was. He was a former British Lions rugby international, 6'4", built like a cathedral, and possessed of a quality in combat that his fellow officers described with words they seemed to reach for carefully, as though ordinary language was insufficient. "Brave as 10 lions," said one. "Tactically beyond analysis," said another. What they were observing was a man for whom the chaos of close combat appeared to produce a state of almost supernatural calm. Where other men's hands shook, Mayne's steadied. Where other men's thinking narrowed under fire, Mayne's appeared to expand. By the end of the North African campaign, his personal tally of destroyed aircraft would exceed 100. One man. More aircraft destroyed than any Royal Air Force fighter ace claimed in air combat across the entire Desert War. It is the night of December 14th, 1941, and Paddy Mayne is not the only SAS man in the desert. While Mayne moves toward Tammet, David Stirling himself is leading a separate team toward the airfield at Sirte, 40 miles to the east. A third team, under Lieutenant Bill Fraser, is heading for Agadir further south. 3 teams, 3 targets, the same night. It is the SAS operating exactly as Stirling designed it, dispersed, simultaneous, impossible to anticipate or concentrate a defense against. At Sirte, Stirling's team places their Lewes bombs and withdraws cleanly. At Agadir, Fraser's team destroys 37 aircraft in a single night, a number that would be almost unbelievable if it were not documented in multiple after-action reports. 37 aircraft, 1 team, 1 night. The entire combined effort of that December operation eliminates enough Axis air power to measurably affect Rommel's operational capability in the weeks that follow. But it is Tammet that history remembers, because of what happened after the bombs were set. It is 2,100 hours. We are back where we started. Mayne and 5 men have been dropped within walking distance of the Tammet airfield by an LRDG truck that is already reversing silently into the darkness. No words have been exchanged. 6 men move in single file across black sand, crouched low, no light, no sound beyond the soft compression of boots in desert grit. The airfield perimeter fence is visible ahead, weak lighting, 1 guard visible near the main building. Distant laughter from somewhere to the north. The fence is not an obstacle for men who came to this exact kind of problem prepared. They are through it in seconds. The team splits. 4 men move toward the southern perimeter, where the aircraft are parked in 2 neat rows, engines cold, mechanics long since finished for the night. Mayne moves toward the lights. At 2,140 hours, the door of the officer's mess comes off its hinges under a booted foot. 30 men look up. For 1 full second, nobody moves. Then Mayne shoots the first pilot who reaches for anything. Then his men shoot. Then all 30 German and Italian pilots in that room understand simultaneously, with complete clarity, that they are not safe here and that they never were, and the screaming and running begins. Outside, along the southern perimeter, the bomb team is working down the line of aircraft with the calm efficiency of men who have rehearsed this in their sleep. Press the bomb to the fuel tank. Set the fuse. Move to the next aircraft. Press. Set. Move. The work is almost quiet. Mayne's team sprints into the desert. Behind them, the Axis base does what every military force does when surprised by an enemy it cannot locate. It starts shooting at itself. Guards fire at shadows. Officers shout contradictory orders. Men run in directions that make sense to them individually and no sense collectively. Mayne's team is already a mile away and moving. Then, Mayne counts the explosions. The math is wrong. Some of the time pencil fuses have failed. He can see intact aircraft still on the southern perimeter. Aircraft that will be flying tomorrow, attacking British positions, killing British soldiers. If someone does not go back, he goes back. This is the moment worth pausing on. The airbase behind him is fully alert. Every light is on. Guards are moving in pairs with torches, sweeping the perimeter fence. There are men with rifles at every entrance point, and the sound of vehicles starting as a motorized patrol prepares to search the surrounding desert. The rational calculation, by any military standard, says the mission is complete. You got the ones you got. You leave. You do not walk back through a fully alerted perimeter alone in the dark to finish a job that was already a success by any reasonable measure. Mayne walks back through the perimeter alone in the dark. He finds the aircraft with failed fuses. He replaces the bombs by hand, one aircraft at a time, in silence, 20 meters from guards who are actively searching for him. Then he walks back out. By midnight, the final tally is 24 aircraft destroyed, fuel dumps burning, ammunition stores detonating in sequence through the small hours of the morning. An airbase that cannot put a single plane in the air until repairs are completed, and repairs will take weeks. 6 men. All 6 returned. 1 month after Operation Squatter. 1 month after the Cairo generals voted to have the unit disbanded. Stirling, when the report came in, said later that he remembered thinking everybody now was quite happy that the unit wasn't going to fold, because with a haul like that, they'd be stupid to say no more. They were not disbanded. The immediate result of Detachment was simple. The SAS survived. The longer result was harder to measure and more important. In the 15 months between that first successful raid and Stirling's capture in January 1943, when a German anti-SAS unit specifically assembled to catch him finally did, the unit destroyed more than 250 aircraft on the ground, dozens of supply dumps, hundreds of vehicles. Rommel was forced to divert significant resources from the front lines to guard rear area installations against attacks he could neither predict nor reliably stop. The Germans noticed. German intelligence began producing reports specifically about the threat from small British raiding parties operating from the deep desert interior. Rommel himself referred to Stirling in dispatches, calling him the Phantom Major, a name that acknowledged something the Afrika Korps found deeply unsettling. The enemy was everywhere and nowhere. He appeared on airfields 500 miles behind the front lines and disappeared before any response could arrive. Standard military doctrine had no category for this. The Germans eventually assembled a dedicated anti-SAS unit specifically tasked with catching Stirling. In January 1943, after more than a year of raids, they finally did. He spent the rest of the war in Colditz. His unit continued without him. A few dozen men in the desert had become a strategic problem for an army of hundreds of thousands. That ratio is worth sitting with. The institutional response from British High Command was, as anyone who has spent time studying military bureaucracy will not be surprised to hear, deeply ambivalent. The SAS was expanded, reorganized, given better equipment, awarded decorations. It was also simultaneously resisted, underfunded, and after the war, formally disbanded, altogether, in 1945. It took a counterinsurgency emergency in Malaya 5 years later to bring it back, by which point the lesson had already spread outward. American Special Operations Doctrine, the architecture of Delta Force, the conceptual foundations of every modern Tier 1 unit, carries the fingerprints of what Stirling built in a 3-tent camp with 66 men and furniture stolen from the New Zealand Army. Paddy Mayne ended the war as the most decorated British officer who never received the Victoria Cross. He was recommended for it after his final action in April 1945, when he drove a jeep alone into an ambush to rescue pinned-down men, cleared 2 buildings of German paratroopers by himself, and then drove up and down a road under direct fire to draw the enemy's attention while his men escaped. The citation was signed off by Field Marshal Montgomery himself. It was downgraded without explanation to a 3rd bar on his Distinguished Service Order. Over 100 members of Parliament formally raised the matter decades later, calling it a grave injustice. The reasons for the downgrade have never been satisfactorily explained. He returned to Northern Ireland, worked as a solicitor, drove a red sports car, and died in a car accident in 1955 at the age of 40. The funeral procession in Newtownards stretched for a mile. His neighbors appeared to understand something that the Honors Committee had not managed to work out. There is a pattern buried inside this story that goes well beyond the aircraft count and the tactical elegance, and it is worth sitting with for a moment. Stirling proved that institutional size does not equal institutional effectiveness, that the most valuable asset in any organization is not the largest force, but the most precisely applied one, and that the people at the top of conventional hierarchies are structurally, almost inevitably, going to resist unconventional approaches, not because they are stupid, but because unconventional approaches, if they succeed, imply that the conventional approach was wrong all along. And nobody likes being told they were wrong, especially not people who have built entire careers on being right. Stirling once wrote that the SAS should be used to cause the maximum dislocation of the enemy's plans and intentions. Maximum dislocation, not maximum force, not maximum numbers. Maximum dislocation. 6 men walked onto an airbase that employed hundreds. They burned 24 aircraft. They walked back out. The conventional wisdom of every general in Cairo said this was impossible. The conventional wisdom was wrong. Who dares wins.